Welcome to Chef Leadership Academy. This lecture is on entrepreneurship by necessity. We associate entrepreneurship with passion, obsession, and even the dreams. But I find that entrepreneurship actually is more universal than that. And probably some of the best entrepreneurs have come out of sheer survival needs, or what I call entrepreneurship by necessity. This has been especially true if you look at the history of America, where refugees who came from Eastern European countries when the Tsars collapsed and communism came, for example. These were, of course, Russian Jews, Polish Jews, etc. And similarly, you have seen refugees that have come recently from Middle East, for example. It's a sheer survival instinct. I want to talk about entrepreneurship by necessity as another paradigm, and I'll start with a key example first before I get into the reasons why entrepreneurship by necessity is an increasing necessity in our society. And if you want to be an entrepreneur arising out of necessity, what should you do? This particular story goes back to late 70s. After the first energy crisis, there were two industries massively impacted. One was the nuclear power plants and the other one was aerospace industry. So by early 80s, lots of engineers from India were out of job. They were single wage earners. They were in their early 30s, fully nested family, kids in the grade school or middle school, and wife did not work. Traditional family of 2 kids and a dog, a homemaker and a breadwinner. There are no future prospects. All of them had masters in engineering. They had come as students and got jobs. They used to do actually more overtime during weekends even to save some money. Typical Asian attitude and a culture. And surprisingly, in fact, they were all totally basically jobless. They had homes in suburbs, typical putting roots in the country and the community. And now what do? Most of them ended up becoming franchisees for Dunkin' Donuts, Baskin Robbins, franchisees for any other kind of a fast food operations, gas stations, for example, convenience stores, and some of them actually ended up also getting into the hotel-motel business. In fact, hotel-motel business, which is today dominated by the South Asian community or Indian community, is surprisingly due to the typical becoming refugees from Uganda. Many Indians had to leave. They went to England, they went to Canada, and then ultimately settled in America. And they're the largest hotel-motel owners with a network of billions of dollars today. If you go back to the same people today, which I have done, after 35, 40 years and ask them, would they have changed anything for their life? They would say, absolutely not. It is the best thing that ever happened to them. They suddenly became owners from the employees. The old dream would have been to stay in a company as engineers, rise to become, for example, a factory manager or in research lab, etc. Maybe aspire to become the CEO of the company at best, which was not possible in those days. And they would have retired very nicely. Stay with the same company where you joined with your first job and end your retirement and a career with the same company. That was gone. That was not a choice anymore. And all of a sudden, entrepreneurship by necessity became a reality. All of them are very affluent today. Some of them are multi-millionaires. And surprisingly, they invested heavily in their own children's education, sent them to top private universities or public universities, Berkeley, UCLA, Michigan, Texas, in Austin, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, or Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, etc. And the rest is history. Why entrepreneurship by necessity is becoming increasingly necessity. And I have identified 4 major factors that are going to drive more and more this reality. So you have this mid-career, well-educated, experienced manager or a supervisor in the company who suddenly finds that they are surplus in the society. The 4 drivers are massive amount of work automation, especially with computerization of everything. And of course, today with cloud computing and mobile computing, it is accelerating much faster than we ever realized. So automation seems to be the biggest factor in creating this surplus of well-talented, well-educated, well-experienced workforce. Second major reason is that more and more we see now contract employees or contract workers. Companies are less and less willing to hire as regular employees, or they would prefer that you retire much sooner in your 40s, not in your 60s or the 70s. And this growth in employee-based or contract-based employees, as I call them, is massive. My estimates are running that, for example, the largest single corporation arising is called Self Inc. And there will be about 6 million people who actually refuse to work as employees for corporations. They're much better off as contractors. They can control their hours as exempt employees, for example, command hourly wages more than they would done as salary wages, etc., etc. The third major factor is an enormous surplus of global talent. At one time, the talent was limited primarily to advanced economies, but today talent is emerging as much, especially for knowledge workers, from advanced economies as well as emerging economies. And the last factor, and very important factor, is that we are all living longer, which is interesting. Life expectancy is just rising. It is very common today to have centenarians, which was almost unthinkable about a century ago, or about 25 years ago. So these are the forces that are driving entrepreneurship by necessity. What does it take? How do you shift your mindset from an employee mindset to an owner mindset? And most of us are primarily experts in a field, and of course there is a dearth of expertise. Today, with artificial intelligence and absolutely the rapid growth of technology, it is very possible that many of the mundane tasks that we do can be taken over by the machine. This is nothing new. In fact, in the 80s, the CAD/CAM technology, computer-aided manufacturing, computer-aided design, actually took over lots of work that were done by engineers as strictly draft people. Architectural firms, lots of people just did typical draft work on blue stencils and all this stuff. That's all done by computers today with far more efficiency, far more productivity, and far more capabilities. So in this environment, how do you succeed? So here are a few recommendations. The first recommendation is to have a proactive plan that you will shift from being an employee in a corporation and a typical career to becoming an entrepreneur outside the corporation. And this plan is very important. It should be a proactive plan so that it is not like a crisis management. It is looking into the future or back to the future essentially, and also developing a positive mindset to make that bungee jump. Second point is that you must prepare a planned exit. Whatever you're doing now, how do you exit from that as a typical predictable career path to something else like entrepreneurship that you must do? And preparing a planned exit is very important, which says that you might go from a dual income to a single income, for example. You want to ensure that you have a financial survival, because in entrepreneurship, what you need most It's a marathon race, not a 100-meter dash. And in a marathon race, most of the athletes actually consume complex carbohydrates the night before, so you have the stamina for the long run. They eat pasta. And pasta for business or entrepreneurship is cash or cash flow. It's very important, therefore, to make sure that you have a runway for financial survival as a part of your exit plan, however you do it. The third very important activity would be network, network, network. Network with a church community or faith-based communities. Very common among Christians, very common among Islamic culture, very common among all faiths that I know. Network also with community and community activities and engagement, so you begin to meet people who might help you in some fashion that you never thought was possible. Of course, if you are minorities coming to this country, you have the whole diaspora, very large Chinese diaspora, Vietnamese diaspora, Indian diaspora, whatever the diaspora are that, and of course the old migration from Europe had a very strong Jewish diaspora. Diaspora helps far more than we have recognized, as the Indian community has clearly shown in the hotel motel or the hospitality business. And as the Ismailis, as we call them, one branch of Islam, have clearly shown in gas stations and in convenience stores. And the last one is to network with professional membership organizations. If you are obviously an engineer or a knowledge worker of some sort, you already belong to some professional associations. Joining some professional associations members will again give you a lot more network opportunities. Point number 4, embrace franchise opportunities. Quite often, as well-educated people, we think franchise is something meant for high school or less educated people. But franchise actually is a very viable opportunity because the platform, the architecture, the operational stuff is all organized by the franchisor. All you have to do is to put a lot of sweat. And suddenly, as owner-managed business, you will work harder than ever before in your life. You have very successful franchisees in Amway distributors or Avon Cosmetics, Mary Kay Cosmetics. They're all agents, but they're really franchisees of that particular brand. Most of the health supplements have the same kind of an organization, whether it's a multi-level marketing or a traditional franchise operation. Fast food operations are very popular for franchise operations. But there are also industrial franchisees or franchise options. Snap-on Tools is one of them. And of course, hotel motel franchises that we already talked about. Surprisingly, fastest growing area is a technician franchise. If you are an individual plumber or an individual heating cooling person, now you are getting organized into a franchise system very similar to Uber. Uberization of the world is taking place, which I find fascinating because more recently I had 2 experiences in 1 week which showed you how entrepreneurship by necessity is more and more the reality. I ordered an Uber car to go to downtown Atlanta, and the driver who drove me actually was in the telephone company, managing a total of 5,000 telephone operators, I guess, or technicians. And he was suddenly a surplus. Through automation on the one hand, merger of the companies on the other hand, and then he had switched to another company which was a bank, and surprisingly in the bank they outsourced the whole IT department, and therefore he was a surplus, and he was driving Uber car. That was his first week on the job. I had met a week before somebody who also was in the telephone industry, primarily again in the IT area, again found that managing outsourcing people in India, for example, on telephone calls, primarily call centers or BPOs, was a 24/7. His lifestyle just did not fit that very well, young family, and he decided to become a car salesman 20 years ago. And he's happy in his new job. So a lot has to do with the opportunities and the mindset. Franchise offers a lot more opportunities very quickly because you don't have to go through learning operational management or operational excellence. Number 5, very important to have frugal operations or frugal mindset. It's like frugal innovation. Why do you think Chinese restaurants always survive? First of all, there are no overheads, and the family works with no wages. Many years ago, in the 80s, I remember, I went to the new opened up island in Hawaii chain called Malacca, and I found fascinating there were 2 Chinese restaurants. I was at a resort, but I wanted to eat out. There was no McDonald's, there was no Burger King, and they couldn't even find the economics of doing franchise operations there, but 2 Chinese restaurants were thriving. Then I learned that in Chinese restaurants, whole family works, and therefore your labor is free. Of course, in Chinese restaurants, like in Thai restaurants, you find, interestingly, there is no real recipe. What you have is 5-10 ingredients, a few condiments, you mix and match, and you can have the meal very fast, very affordable, and therefore the cash flow comes from repeat purchase, more like consumer packaged goods. Very fascinating. So frugality is absolutely the essence. And I find that people of Indian origin managing hotel motels in small towns where they dominate. The family lives on the property. In other words, behind the reception area, there may be a room which is their living room. They work with the workers there. They're 24/7 in the business. There are no overheads of the kind that we think about in a typical large corporation. So to me, frugal operations or frugal mindset is very important if you are going to be an entrepreneur by necessity. I found that during the days of the dot-com boom in the late 90s, you could get any money, in fact, just on PowerPoint presentation, no real business even, $10-15 million. And most of the entrepreneurs immediately rented a large space as if they will have 500 or 400 employees. Business does not come, and in a typical startup business, your revenues will always be later than you think, and your cost will be much sooner than you think. So you obviously have a cash flow problem. Most of them get diluted if they go back to the VC community and borrow money. Again, their equity goes to nothing practically. I've seen many examples. Instead, if you are frugal, in fact, most successful corporations really have begun in garages. Very humble beginnings, struggling quite a lot from a cash flow and a capital viewpoint. So how do you create that frugal mindset even though one becomes a successful entrepreneur out of necessity? Point number 6, lean on friends and family. And of course, in some cultures, the friends and the family help you out quite a lot because it is their social governance mechanism, it is their social network mechanism, it is Guangxi principle maybe in China, or reciprocity principles of some sort, doing favors to each other, helping each other out in the community. It is true among the, for example, Indian diamond merchants, true among the Indian hotel motel owners. Many industries have this strong diaspora, not only family members, but also the community members, as it is in the Western world with the faith-based organizations. So looking for angel investing is very important. I'm opposed to VC capital. Venture capital should not be taken if at all possible because venture capitalists have only one interest, How do I increase my multiple of what I paid to when I exit in a very short period of time? Put a young person on your board who really has no real practical experience in any ways. Every quarter he's pushing for more and more growth when growth may actually collapse you, etc., etc. So my preference always has been to see if you can get angel capital, how you can get that capital, hopefully from friends and family. Also, you can get from friends and family a lot of volunteer labor or volunteer talent. They may not be paid at all, or they might be paid in some future compensation. And family members often work in the business. So many successful entrepreneurs by necessity have found that engaging the family members quickly into the business is a reality, as we find, for example, in the Korean community when they are primarily managing dry cleaning business, for example. We have found that many Korean communities where they are managing, let's say, gardening business, landscaping business. In California, that's very common. It's getting common on the East Coast also, etc., etc. So lean on friends and family is an equally important area. Discover one customer, point number 7. All successful businesses today, multi-billion dollars, and I've analyzed more than 100 businesses, I find there is this universal truth, surprisingly, that they were all made by one account, one customer. Not by the size of the market or how much market share you have, it was just one customer. From Whirlpool Corporation to Hewlett-Packard to Daimler-Benz to Microsoft to Intel, I can give you examples across industries. They were all made by one customer. In fact, they were struggling quite often, and more than half the time, customer discovered them. They did not discover the customer, just by chance or however it happened. So one key account makes the difference. Discover one. Search for it actively, rather than talking about this blue sky notion about how big the business opportunity is. And the last point is what Sam Walton proved again and again, founder of Walmart, when people said, how can you go into rural America with 15,000 or less population and make money? Or how can you compete against world-class corporations at that time like Kmart and of course Sears Roebuck? And he would smile and had a key answer, same answer, hit them where they ain't. In other words, go to places where there will be less intense competition. There will be no fast followers or imitators. And this is a very interesting area. And I find in the US, that market is in rural America. Dollar General has already proven that in retailing. While all other retailers are struggling, Dollar General is growing, for example, because they've targeted that rural, small town markets. There are neglected segments in every industry. You can identify neglected segments either by geography, physical location, or you can identify neglected segments by demographics, or by psychographics as we call them, does not matter, but there are always neglected segments. Or there is, of course, while you have the 20-80 ratio, 20% of the market will be, 20% of the customers will control 80% of the market, but at the same time you have a long tail of niche opportunities. So think about what niche you would like to go where you just dominate that niche and nobody else can come in that niche, or nobody else would like to come in that niche. We often refer to also this as a blue ocean strategy. Red ocean is the ocean of a lot of intense competition, and there are other opportunities out there. For example, in India, I find very fascinating the simplest opportunity, and I don't know how many times this opportunity is there, is to take any unbranded product and make it branded. Take anything that is made in a local market, street food, street snacks, for example, and make it into national or global. Recently, we have seen an example in the traditional Ayurvedic medicine, a company has emerged called Patanjali, and in less than 5 years has grown to about $1 billion corporation, knocking the doors of Unilever in India, or ITC, which is another major food company, for example, or health company, and they are almost rivaling that. What took Unilever maybe 75 years, these people have done it in 5 years. Why? Because they dealt with a product category where the whole distribution is highly unorganized. Most of the products were unbranded. There is no quality assurance. Very simple idea. Or converting non-users into users. That's it. Opportunities are staring at you. This is all different thinking than a traditional one to say, I would like to compete where there are competitors. Here it says, I would like to go where there are no competitors altogether, like make versus buy. And in emerging economies, more and more young people would rather buy than make, such as, for example, meals every day. So there are huge opportunities of converting unbranded products into branded products, unorganized sector into organized sector, and of course, from make versus buy, converting non-users into users. So let me conclude this presentation by mentioning that while entrepreneurship is often associated with passion, obsession, and the dreams, entrepreneurship by necessity is a growing necessity. 4 forces are driving this necessity. The biggest one is work automation, especially of knowledge workers, not just the, let's say, clerical workers or the factory workers. Second one actually is more and more people working as contract labor or contract employees. Movie industry is full of nothing but contract labor, for example. Hollywood depends on that. Also, in fact, there is a huge surplus of global talent now, with emerging economies educating more and more people into engineering, science, math, or management. And of course, we are living longer and longer, which says the labor pool is going to rise or stay much bigger than we imagined. To succeed in entrepreneurship by necessity will require shifting primarily an employee mindset to an owner-managed business mindset. To me, that's very critical, foundational necessity. And then, as I mentioned, to ensure success, one needs to develop a proactive plan, a planned exit at the same time, and also embrace franchising opportunities, even though that may be a step below your education level and your, let's say, employment category. You are a managerial class, and now you are becoming more like a high school educated franchisee. But it's very good. That is how wealth is created in America, at least. It also means having frugal operations, leaning more on family and friends for both money as well as time. Time, treasure, talent, as we call it in philanthropy. Philanthropy or charity begins at home in this case. And finally, discovering one customer and going into places where there is nobody else, or hit them where they ain't. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. Thank you very much.